In the last episode of Frontlines, we showed you the threat to America's power grid is real. In this chapter, we'll look at an even greater danger posed by an adversary like Iran, North Korea, or even ISIS. It's called electromagnetic pulse, or EMP.
These high-powered transmission lines running across the Nevada desert carry electricity to almost 4 million people. It's called the Pacific DC Intertie, and it goes from Oregon, where the power is generated, all the way to Los Angeles. There are almost 150,000 miles of power lines like this across the United States. And out here in the Nevada desert, you can see how difficult it would be to secure a network this vast. There's no security whatsoever, and that could spell trouble for anybody that's reliant on this network. But the transformers on either end of the line are even more vulnerable.
They are the foundation stone of our electronic civilization. Everything runs directly or indirectly on electricity. None of our critical infrastructures will work. Not communications, not business, transportation, even food and water depend ultimately on electricity. And these EHV transformers is what makes the modern electric grid possible. It can't run without them.
A major problem with transformers is the fact that the cost associated with them. The larger transformers on the 500 kV can be in excess of $10 to $20 million for one transformer. The ability to have a spare, it's a hard argument sometimes from an economic perspective if you have something that's going to last 50 years.
In the whole entire world, the global production is less than 200 of these a year. And we have 2,000 of them in our grid.
The U.S. grid was originally designed to move electricity short distances from production to consumer. But there hasn't been a new generation plant built in decades, and that means power must now travel much further than originally planned. Even worse, the average EHV transformer is over 40 years old.
It's very hard to replace even one of these things. There's only 2 railway cars in the whole country that are specially designed to accommodate these EHV transformers. You have to reinforce bridges, reinforce the highways, because they're so heavy, you can't just move them into place. But like so many things, we don't even make them in this country anymore. There's only 2 countries in the world that make them for export, South Korea and Germany. They have to be custom made. You can't mass produce them.
If a terrorist attack were to somehow destroy even a small number of these transformers, the results would be catastrophic.
Well, it's the greatest threat our civilization faces right now. And I've studied weapons of mass destruction, all the various kinds of threats, chemical, biological, nuclear, physical sabotage, that this country faces. And the one that's always worried me the most is electromagnetic pulse. And that's because it's the easiest to pull off. You get the biggest bang for the buck. With a single nuclear weapon, you could destroy this whole country by a high-altitude detonation. And at the same time, it's the least understood. Many people don't understand that it is real.
EMP is essentially a man-made version of the solar coronal ejections that have been hitting the Earth from the sun for billions of years.
We get these eruptions, these coronal mass ejections, during a normal solar maximum when the peak in activity, you can see 3 or 4 a day. But it's really when you get the big ones. So it's almost like earthquakes. So if you watched a map, you can see there are lots of little earthquakes every day, but you don't get the big ones that often. We watch for these eruptions, we model them, we say, how fast are they going? What direction are they going? Will they get here? Will they affect Earth? We have really 3 phases of pulse, the short, the medium, and the long.
The real problem, in a way, is the third type of electromagnetic pulse, which has very long wavelength and low frequency. After a nuclear detonation, that will affect the transmission lines, and it can be carried by the transmission lines and travel very long distances, thousands of miles along the transmission lines, knocking out the transformers as it goes. Knocking out transformers is like knocking out your or my heart. The electrical grid doesn't function without the transformers that step up voltage in order for it to be transmitted long distances and then step it down again so it can be distributed in your neighborhood and to your house.
You don't have to be a genius to realize that if an EMP attack were to destroy large numbers of these transformers, it could shut us down into a blackout that could last months, years, perhaps permanently. Everything is interconnected, and everything electronic depends on the grid in one way or another. It's not as if electricity goes down, you say,
darn, I've got to walk up to the corner gas station with my gas can and fill up from the pump and come back and put it in the car so I can drive to work. No, I'm afraid the electric pump is, indirectly at least, at the filling station, is also on the grid, and so it won't work. And I'm afraid your car has had all of its electronics fused.
A protracted blackout is not like an inconvenience like you have with a short-term blackout. There are vastly important and vastly dangerous industrial facilities, including nuclear reactors, that depend on the power grid so that they don't blow up. Typically, they do have emergency generating power at these facilities, but usually it's like for 72 hours. Look at what happened at Fukushima, Japan, when they had a protracted blackout. We've got over 100 nuclear reactors in this country, and they're co-located with our population centers.
I think that people don't want to look at horror in the face. If electricity goes down, you're not back in the 1980s pre-web. You're back in the 1880s pre-electric grid. And very few of us have enough water pump handles and plow horses to manage in the 19th century world. It's imaginable to have a setup for your house where you are off-grid. If one was off-grid, you still would have to have your household electrical connections protected, but even then, a handful of people operating off-grid, unless they live out in the mountains somewhere and no one's around, you've got an off-grid house and some food and water, and I don't have any, and I'm absolutely desperate, and I come across you, I might first ask politely, and then you would have to worry that I might not be kind in trying to stay alive. Military bases and police headquarters are going to be as much without light and water and food as all the rest of us. We're used to having a disaster and having people show up who can deal with it, whether they're firefighters or police or the National Guard or whatever, and they have trucks and they have boats and they have things that can cope with it. But if nobody has any electricity, they can't move. They're in as bad shape as the rest of us.
In the event of a large-scale disruption in our electric grid, we'll all find out just how energy dependent we really are. In the next episode of Frontlines, you'll hear from our experts on what we can do to reduce our vulnerability to EMP. I'm Oliver North, and that's next on Frontlines.